welcome to the Talent Tide Podcast, the show that ensures you have the information you need to adapt and evolve your workplace culture as you ride the wave of change in talent management. I'm your host, Chris Nichols, and today we're going to be talking technical recruitment and recruiting trends with Jesse Tinsley, the CEO at JobMobz and the host of the People Podcast. Jesse is a serial entrepreneur who got his start in tech at the age of 15. In 2012, he dropped out of college to found JobMobz, a recruiting and staffing firm that provides on-demand recruiting for technology companies. He's a regular contributor to Forbes and SourceCon. Additionally, he hosts the People Podcast, where he interviews HR and recruiting leaders, as well as HR tech founders on the latest trends in the industry. Jesse has a passion for delivering world-class talent to startups and Fortune 500 companies alike. Welcome, Jesse. Thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris. Really appreciate it.
No problem. So I have to admit that I guess I've been a fan of yours for a while, Jesse, because I followed you on Twitter for far longer than you knew who the heck I was. So that feels a little strange for me.
Yeah, that's nice of you to say. I really appreciate the kind words, and just trying to add value on Twitter. It's a long slog, I feel like, on Twitter in general. But yeah, I appreciate the kind words.
HR Twitter and recruiting Twitter is definitely an interesting place. It's a very, it's like a small sect of the Twitterverse.
Yeah, it's definitely a very niche community, right? There's like the core, like 20 people, and I feel like that's really small for an internet community, like Twitter specifically, right? Where a lot of the groups have hundreds or thousands of people, and HR and recruiting Twitter is very much siloed in its own little universe, so to speak. So
yeah, it's not hard. It's not too hard to find the 20 people either. It's definitely unique. It's an industry that's kind of unique on Twitter, at least, in the fact that there is a small subset of people with a large number of followers. So there's obviously a lot of people that are watching the conversation, but don't necessarily take part in the conversation, which may say a lot about the HR and recruiting industries anyway.
Yeah, it's definitely a very unique community. And I think it's quite interesting. You have the people that are talking about like very serious HR recruiting stuff, and then the recruiting and HR like meme universe. But I guess that's the same with all Twitter channels, right? So
yeah, that's fair. At least I don't think that we have very many there's not many negative folks, I guess you could say, in the TA space on Twitter. So I guess we do have that going for us.
Yeah, very positive community, which is nice.
Well, again, I'm excited to have you on today, Jesse. I'm by no means an expert in the IT world or industry, so I'm excited to get your thoughts on IT recruiting and technical recruiting. And obviously, being out in California, it's a different world, especially in Silicon Valley, and how those organizations recruit. And it's always interesting when you have a market like the IT industry in a very heavily localized market like the Bay Area. And so it makes for very in-demand recruitment ideals and people, and you have to have top talent in order to be able to find the top talent, right? And so, but I want to step back maybe potentially a decade or more ago or so, and I've got to tell you, you're far braver than I am, Jesse, because when I read your bio and saw that you dropped out of school in 2012 to found your own company, that is, for somebody like myself who's very conservative, I could have never done that. So what drove you to make that decision, and why was the timing right in 2012?
Yeah, it's interesting timing, I think. So for me, to even step back further, I actually bootstrapped my company by working as a firefighter on the weekends. So it wasn't totally risky, right? I still had a fail safe, so to speak. Sure. So I think what the best advice for like anybody that's looking at doing that is keep your day job and work on your side hustle, which in my case was a recruiting firm. And then it's some inflection point. I think around 2015, I actually just stopped and did recruiting full time, right? So it took a couple of years to transpire, but part of that is I didn't really see it as much of a risk at that point, right? So if I just stopped doing everything and focused on recruiting in 2012, it probably would have been a much bigger risk. So I found a way to de-risk it, so to speak.
Yeah, and recruiting might have been the first gig economy, potentially, when you think about the fact that it's always been an industry where there's a low cost of entry, right? You just need to be able to understand how to talk to people, how to network. So why recruiting, and what kind of drove you to jump into that particular industry?
Yeah, so I got started recruiting actually when I was 15 years old. So my mother was in recruiting, and so I kind of fell into it in that regard. I think like most people have interesting recruiting stories of how they fell into the space or the practice, right? It's not like you go to college and you're like, oh, I got a degree in recruiting. It's like, I got a degree in marketing or business and I fell into recruiting, right? Like, I think that's the most common story is somebody had some other previous life or career and then moved into recruiting. So I think that's kind of, I have a more or less traditional path of getting into it from like a career perspective. But so that's kind of the initial happenings, I guess.
No, that's funny because that you say that, because there really is like two paths into the recruitment world, right? You either know somebody as a family member or something that's in the recruiting industry, or you are 22 and you came out of college and you don't have a job, and a recruiting firm calls you and they say, we'd like to hire you, because that's what a lot of third party staffing firms do, right? They hire a lot of fresh college grads. And so the first time that I remember, under, like, my sister is how I got started in the third party recruitment world, and she had her business for quite some time. It was in the industry, and I remember constantly being in high school and being like, I don't understand what you do or how it works, or how you're making money off of this industry. So I'm going to need more information. So eventually I joined her company, and that's how I got started too. But so interesting parallel there. But so thinking about technical recruiting, because I do want to kind of jump now to where we are today in a way, but maybe looking pre-COVID and post-COVID, can you paint the picture of what the technical recruiting scene is kind of like in the Bay Area for those of us who maybe don't have the same exposure to what it looks like to recruit against the Facebooks and the Googles and those folks of the world?
Yeah, it's always been really competitive. I think even more so in the last year or two, where basically we've seen the with lockdown specifically, we're seeing a huge amount of competition, right? Because we're no longer just competing in this one local geography, right? We're basically competing for talent across the entire U.S., right? So that's really opened things up tremendously, where it's no longer just about the ability to have. I do apologize. I'm going to stop for a second. So this will be an edit, simply because my dog's barking. One of my dogs. I'm not sure if you hear that, but somebody came to the door. I can probably take, if you want to just repeat the question, it'd probably be easier for
That's fine.
editing versions. If you just repeat the question, I can just flow right into it, and she can just cut that segment.
Okay, cool. So Jesse, moving forward, kind of getting away from how you got started in the industry, I'd like to kind of get an idea from you what technical recruiting looks like in the Bay Area for those of us who haven't been exposed to it and don't understand what it's like to have to compete in the startup space against really some of the largest companies in the world like Facebook and Google.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we've seen a few different things happen, obviously, in the last year with COVID and being locked down, right? Where we're no longer just competing in the Bay Area for talent, but across the entire US. And so that's really created a lot of challenges, I think, for startups. Obviously, if you're a large company like the Stripes and Facebooks and Googles of the world, they have money to throw around, and they're going to have a much better chance at getting candidates. But I think if I was recruiting for a startup, my advice to them is figure out what the candidate's why is, right? Like what it is that they're looking for in their next career opportunity, and then sell against that, right? Besides compensation, obviously you want to compensate fairly, but there's other things that motivate technical talent beyond that, right? We can obviously dive into those, but they're pretty basic. But basically figure out why and sell what your value prop is as a company against that.
Well, unique. I mentioned how recruitment might have been the first gig industry, but IT wasn't far behind that, like that. And I hate using the word IT because there's so much more to the technical side of the business
Yeah.
of businesses anyway, and somehow it all gets lumped into information technology, and it's like that's not exactly what that means, right? And so, what is it that's driving software engineers that may be different than an RN, or is there a difference in the motivators for what they're looking for in their careers?
Yeah, there certainly is. I think at least like looking at data, because we collect a lot of data in regards to candidates we talk to, some of the more common ones are going to be basically technical challenges, like the overall like scope of the project, right? Like if you're working on like a port over of the code, a port over being like if we're just transferring one code base to another, that's probably less interesting. But if we're working on like the latest AI or some other technology that's very like new and niche, that's much more interesting to technical engineers specifically. Beyond that, other things would be like the actual product that we're working on. So making sure that there's alignment there of the company, right? I think for recruiter, if you're a recruiter, right, I'm looking at my career opportunities. For me personally, it's always been working at companies that I'm interested in the actual product, right? Because recruiting is very much like a sales role. And so that's why I've worked at companies like 23andMe and Coinbase, because I believed in the mission and the purpose. And so it's easy for me to get behind that and put on my sales hat, so to speak. So yeah, that's kind of the quick overview, but I think it comes down to technical challenges and for engineers in general, kind of what those.
It's almost more of an entrepreneurial mindset in the comfort of working for someone else. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think money is not often a motivating factor. It is obviously for some, right? Like you're 100% going to find people that will just jump at the highest offer, but I think more often than not in technical hiring in general, and that doesn't even have to be engineering. It can be sales, it can be marketing, it can be recruiting, G&A. You're really going to you find a lot of people in the Bay Area specifically that are very entrepreneurial driven or interested in working at startups for a pay cut. And I think that's very unique to the ecosystem of just being in the Bay Area.
Sure. So post-COVID, you mentioned pre-COVID, there was a very dense grouping of that talent there, right? And obviously now, I think there's two markets that have potentially been affected more than any other, which is Silicon Valley, Bay Area, and New York, Manhattan, as far as kind of an exodus of people that now realize they don't have to work, they don't have to live where they work anymore. How do you view organizations adjusting to the new normal? I hate that term, but how do you see those companies adjusting to recruiting going forward and understanding how to attract that talent? And does it help students and candidates that maybe aren't from the blue chip schools as well?
Yeah, so I think the big thing when we look at where, first off, there was definitely a mass exodus, whether people want to admit it or not. A lot of people have moved. I think that's obviously going to impact how companies recruit in general. I think there's a lot of companies that haven't decided whether they're going to be full-time remote. I think the first order effect is that candidates are going to expect full remote. It's no longer just like a nice to have, or we're going to go back next, end of this year. That's not going to fly for a lot of people that have moved, right? And so I know it's an interesting debate that's been happening across social media, and I think just across companies of what's kind of the next step there. And I think to give it context, even the companies that previously were in the office had very much distributed and remote engineering teams, and that is a fact. You can look at any of the large companies, Google, Facebook, Stripe, Coinbase. Those companies already had remote engineering teams for the most part, right? Like for niche roles, like a security engineer, an HPC engineer, those folks were already working remotely, and now it's just going to spread to the rest of the organization for the most part. And if they don't adopt, they're going to lose a lot of talent very quickly because there's 10 other companies that are hiring remotely, and they're going to pay you competitive salary. I know the other concern was that salaries are going to go down, and I've actually seen the opposite. Salaries have just gotten more competitive for those talent. Like you can go and look across. I was just doing some searches in the last couple of weeks for engineers, and you can look across the Midwest, and there's just a lack, or across the U.S. in general, there's a lack of qualified engineers, regardless of what state they're in. You can look Florida, Texas, Midwest, Arizona, California, there's not a lot of great engineers that are actively looking. And so I just see the talent crunch being it's even more competitive now that everyone's hiring remotely.
I completely agree. That's what we're seeing as well, Jesse, is the fact that especially those employees that were held on to and weren't furloughed or laid off during COVID, they're much more sticky to the companies that they were with pre-COVID because they understand what all these organizations that they work for went through, and the fact that they kept them around, I think, is adding an additional layer to for recruiters to have to work through today. It's requiring a lot more to pull somebody, I think, away because of the feelings that they have towards the organization that kept them around. Are you seeing some of that as well?
I think there's some of that. I think not to change the subject, I think something that's interesting, like a second order effect, is like, let's say we do go back to the office. What's going to happen with the culture of the company when everyone that was hired in the last 6 to 12 months goes back into an office together, right? That's obviously going to shift the culture and the impact, and like thinking through thoughtfully how that's going to change a lot of things, right? So, or if it's some type of mixed schedule, right, where you're basically going into the office like 2 days a week or 1 day a week, and then how do you rotate the team? So it's gonna be very interesting from a cultural perspective. Yeah, just to touch on that, I think.
Well, that's you obviously are a good podcast host yourself, because it was a nice segue, because I was going to go to culture next, which is I think the whole idea of company culture, in my opinion, and like what we think of it today, really kind of originates out of Silicon Valley and the Google headquarters and what that looks like and how it is there. And you had all these companies across the country, all of a sudden felt like they needed to have ping pong tables and all this silly stuff. And post COVID, like, do these companies realize they didn't need all of that stuff in the first place? Like, what does that world look like going forward? Because people are happy maybe just working from home, right?
Yeah, I think we moved to a outcome-based economy, right? For a lot of tech companies, at least, where it's no longer like, I think early on in my career, I had some trouble where it's like we had customers that wanted me on site for 8 to 10 hours a day, right? And that was just, even though I was outproducing everybody else on the recruiting team, that wasn't success. Success was just being in the office, showing your face. And I think we're transitioning to an economy where it's just create results, and we don't care if you work 2 hours or 10 hours, like whatever it takes to get it done, right? And I think that is really interesting from a cultural perspective, because now it rewards high performers as opposed to burning them out, right? So hopefully they stay longer, right? If I'm at a job and I'm making 6 figures, why would I leave if I'm working 2 hours a day, but I'm hitting all my numbers and I'm excelling personally and professionally? Like, that seems like a pretty sticky situation from a work environment. So I think it benefits both the employer and the employee immensely. And I think that's going to impact culture and productivity a lot.
I completely agree.
And to caveat that, I'd say that we're not even working remotely, right? I worked remotely for the last couple of years, and I can tell you that with COVID, this isn't remote work, right? I've got my kids here,
right,
day out, right, running around. The dogs are barking, like, because the kids are active, and like, it's not normal work environment where everyone's stuck at home, right? So I think true work from home is much, much different, and it's much more enjoyable and probably definitely more productive for everybody, right? Whether you're a father or mother and you're taking care of your kids, right? That's going to obviously have a huge impact on your productivity. So it gets easier.
I couldn't agree more. As somebody that's worked from home since 2018, the last year of working from home has been totally different than the first 2.5 or 3 years of working from home. And it has created a whole, and the fact that companies are seeing productivity increases or relatively remaining flat, and yet there still are a whole host of challenges in work from home today that may not exist a year from now, right? Like, that's fascinating when you think about what the future holds as well. So what, aside from work from home, what are some of the shifts that you've seen over the last year in the recruiting world? And it doesn't have to be necessarily technical specific, but just recruiting in general. What does the post-COVID environment look like for talent acquisition and talent attraction, in your opinion, Jesse?
Yeah, so I know this has been touched on a lot with a lot of different people, but I'm a big proponent of technology in general, obviously, given that I work in tech for a long time. I think we're going to see a lot of automation take place of a lot of jobs in the next 5 to 10 years, specifically in the recruiting space, right? Where you look at automating a lot of your sourcing and scheduling. I think that is pretty much imminent in the next couple of years. And so what that kind of looks like is if we're returning to the workforce, how do we automate and make scheduling more effective, right? It's something that's traditionally really ineffective. Even if you have a full-time scheduler, they're working 8 to 10 hours a day. But the problem with schedulers, in my experience, is candidates generally respond at odd hours, either before work or after work. And that's even maintained relatively the same, even with work from home, is they'll respond to an email saying, hey, I'm available to talk tomorrow at 12 p.m., but it might be 7 p.m. on a Monday. And so your scheduler is not going to see that till the next day. But it's something that software does really, really well. They can just parse the words and say, okay, Jesse's available at 12, let's just schedule it. And I think you're going to see automation in that regard, not at recruiting, right? Like recruiters still have a very important job building relationships and like kind of driving the process. And that I think is going to stay the same. It's like automating sales rep is not going to happen ever, because there's still a human component to a sale. And that's the same thing with recruiting, right? You're selling a candidate on a company, so to speak. And I think that's the big shift we're going to start to see is more and more automation and in streamlined processes. And that's not to get like scary with like AI or machine learning. I think it's just basic algorithms that are automating slow, mundane processes.
Well, that was where I was going to lead next, is the fact that you mentioned some of this technology. So without naming company names, because you're out there and probably even know people at some of these organizations, maybe talk to our listeners about what technology comes first if you're looking to automate some of your task or some of your TA process. How should somebody go about building out a tech stack, in your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It really depends on what you're recruiting for, right? What I'd optimize for and what your goals are. I think obviously you want to go with one of the premier like applicant tracking systems. Beyond that, there's a few different scheduling tools that are super helpful. And then there's also chatbots that help with high volume sourcing, which is super helpful if you're hiring for like manufacturing or warehouse workers where you're having hundreds of applications and you just have very basic like qualifying questions. I think those are the big ones. I think there's a ton of interesting stuff happening in sourcing for specific niche candidates. Without naming companies, I advise a bunch and invested in a bunch. So I won't shill anybody today, but yeah, I think those are some interesting plays. So you're looking at basically scheduling, chatbot automation, obviously in integrating all that into applicant tracking system where it's all in one source of truth, basically. So APIing into the ATS that you're using.
Because that's what I always encourage individuals to think about. Because it's funny, and I don't know if you had this experience or not, but in the third party world, it so often, especially in recruitment outsourcing, when we're talking to a client partner, they're going through, they have problems typically with their TA, their pipeline, et cetera. And I don't know how often it is percentage wise, but it feels like far more often than not, an applicant tracking system is always in motion. And I say in motion, we're always reviewing a new ATS, or we're going to buy a new ATS as if it's some kind of solution. And in reality, it's just a database, right? But so many people see it as a solution to their recruitment problems, and they have no idea what they're buying. Do you have any thoughts around best practices when it comes to applicant tracking systems and buying or looking at how to evaluate their own ATS?
I can definitely tell you the one thing you don't want to do is I won't name the systems, but use the systems that you get for your HRS system for free, and then use that as the ATS, because I've seen that go bad a few different ways with a few different companies. Whenever something's given to you free as part of another package deal, probably not a good way to make TA golden beacon, so to speak, of at the forefront of technology. You're probably gonna get something that's not very useful. But I think so the way to evaluate it is figure out where you're at. I think there's some really good SMB solutions where you probably don't need some of those enterprise companies, or all the APIs, something basic. And I'm not actually an advisor to any of these companies, so I'll just name a few that I like on the SMB side. I really like Lever. I think they're pretty basic, affordable. Jazz HR, if you want to go for like price point and features, like they're very feature rich and very affordable for SMB. We actually use them internally. And then I like Smart Recruiters too. They even have a free version, I think. And that's the first ATS we use. And so those are some like interesting ones on the SMB side. If you start to move up from there on the tech side, I really like Greenhouse for integrations. They have some really cool stuff you can do with data from like Tableau and Looker, where you can pull up like really interesting graphs and charts and show those to your hiring managers. And so those are my go-tos. I haven't had much. I've used iSIMS and a few other the large ones, obviously, in Workday, but not as much of a fan of those for tech companies specifically.
Yeah, and I think that's it's those systems. I think what most HR folks or anybody that's making this decision need to know and think about going forward is that integration piece and what the APIs look like, and are they going to charge you every time that you want to connect something? The technology itself, again, is a database. What you can do with it to expand its power, that's where the value comes in for
totally. I definitely agree. That's one of the knocks I have against Lever is they're pretty siloed system. They want to charge you for your API. Smart Recruiters and Jazz have pretty good open, robust APIs, which is great if you're basically getting that full like talent solution end to end for like scheduling, sourcing, all that stuff, and you're plugging it all into your ATS. And then I think that the best by far is Greenhouse, right? They've created a really robust marketplace of companies that have already API'd, and they actually have open API like documentation. So if you're looking to connect like your sourcing tool or schedule, like they probably already, if they're any notable brand, they're already going to be hooked up on Greenhouse's marketplace. So that's one of the big things I like about Greenhouse is they kind of went the open source route, which is super helpful. I mean, you don't want like what traditionally happened in talent acquisition, right? Is you have like 5 different sources of truth with all these, like you're using, you have this sourcing database on Indeed, and you have like your ATS, and then you have like this other like LinkedIn, and they're all not connected, but Greenhouse does a great job of connecting all of those dots and telling you kind of what's going on, which is helpful.
Which is so valuable, right? Because you need, instead of needing 5 screens up with every one of them on a different platform, you kind of have it all in one place, which I think is really good. And we have a client that is a startup that utilizes Greenhouse, and it's been great from our end. It's great to work with them because all of our tools hook up so effectively. Like we can bolt on and it's no problem. Whereas we have another client who is a Fortune 500 company, and they have a more traditional ATS that they spend a lot of money on every year. And yet, in order to bolt on the same systems that Greenhouse allows us to connect for free or minimal charge, they want $45,000 for that integration to occur, right?
Yeah.
and we have to say, well, that's not feasible for any of, like, it's not feasible for our client. It's not feasible for us. Like, it's not even worth it. We'll figure out alternative ways to fight that battle, right? So anybody that's listening, that's thinking about an ATS, ask better questions. Ask questions about what is valuable, what they do for integrations. The open source piece is big. And, get your sales folks or get somebody in your organization that has been through, database implementations and changes for what they're doing and understand what's valuable to them. Because most HR individuals, this is not something that they're used to working with, right? Like this is not necessarily your expertise. So bring in, like, go find people in your organization that are. Any thoughts on that, Jesse, or who you should contact to get some help when you're looking?
Right. Yeah. I know a lot of this stuff's technical jargon. So if you're not familiar with APIs and everything else, I think can definitely be very, when I first got into it, it's very kind of just over my head, right? And I didn't really know how everything worked. But yeah, bring in a technical solutions architect, or a lot of times, let's say you're using like Indeed or any other like sourcing tool, LinkedIn, or Greenhouse. You can talk to anyone on any of those platforms, and they'll tell you how to basically set it up, or they'll already have it set up, right? Where you could just connect LinkedIn to Greenhouse or whatever ATS. For the most part, they should all connect nowadays. So yeah, definitely bring somebody in that's technical if you need help, or a solutions consultant on the sales side, essentially.
Absolutely. So transitioning a little bit, I do want to talk more of the minutia of TA today, and leave the folks that are listening with, I guess, some third party perspective that also works from a very integrated strategic perspective. So looking at somebody that has worked as part of an on-site external TA resource like yourself, Jesse, but has been able to evaluate those same TA functions while you've been there. How do you evaluate recruitment team performance yourself as a third-party provider? And there's a second part to that question as well, which is, what would you change in your evaluation of recruitment team performance if you were an internal TA leader?
Yeah, they're very different. I think we're obviously joining on project-based work a lot of times. So it's like, we need to hire these 10 engineers. We need to do it like yesterday. Yeah. So we're basically striving towards hires like the rest. Obviously, we want tracking metrics, which is like, we need to source 100 candidates for this role a week to make sure that we're actually tracking to hit these hires in 3-4 months. I think one of the big things that is interesting that you can do as an internal talent acquisition leader is basically baseline your interview process. Let's say that we have recruiters and hire managers that say this person is like the best candidate we've ever interviewed. How do they actually perform in the role over the next couple of years? And then we can actually revise our interview process to say, okay, well, if Jesse says they're a bad hire, they're actually a good hire, or if Chris says they're a good hire, they're a bad hire, whatever the case may be, we can actually adjust people's feedback based off past performance of people they've hired. And I think that's an interesting thing that some companies did some really cool stuff with, like Coinbase and Airbnb historically when they were going through hypergrowth, is benchmarking actual performance against interviews and how we improve and optimize the interview process to hire high performers, right?
That's an interesting one, because obviously quality of hire is like the unicorn of metrics, and it's I don't want to say it's immeasurable, but it is really it's close to it, right? I mean, because it's so qualitative in what is quality of hire anyway, right? There's nothing that there's no metric that can tell you whether or not somebody is quality necessarily. So when you think about benchmarking the interview process, can you share with listeners who maybe have not gotten into that level of detail around the interview process?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different things to measure. It's kind of a tough one, right? Because like obviously you can measure your interview questions and how you're assessing candidates and like the throughput and diversity of the pipeline. I think the more interesting part is when we have exit interviews is where you actually get a lot of feedback, right? So if a candidate is leaving or employee is leaving your company, figure out what they did and didn't like. And you also can do this after the interview process, like what worked well, what didn't, and what like turn them off, what like they liked in regards to the process. So basically just have checkpoints throughout the process, whether it's just like a candidate that maybe didn't receive an offer, like what they didn't like, and then you can get all these data points that gives you kind of a clear picture. And then same thing with employees when they leave. What did they like about the onboarding experience? What could be improved? What could be optimized? And I think going back to your point, which is it's really hard to measure quality of hire because there's so many different factors that go into it. For example, let's say they had a bad, like I think there was a study by ServiceNow where basically if a candidate has a bad onboarding experience, they will start looking. Over majority of candidates will basically start looking for another job within 2 weeks, which is insane. It was over 50%. I don't remember the exact. I don't have it in front of me, but and so like, how do we identify what went wrong to assess quality hire? Did they have a bad manager? Were they not set up for success? Did they have poor onboarding? They don't know where the tools and documents are. And so like measure what's going on within your org, because it's so different from organization to organization, and figure out what your pain points are and always just be iterating, right? Always be learning and trying to make it better.
Those numbers are always fascinating to me because I think that as leaders and those of us that are maybe in corporate positions or centralized positions or management positions, we think about what our own experience would be like going into the job market and interviewing and getting offers and things. And we don't put ourselves in the shoes of those that are in the high volume roles enough, right? Because we do a lot in healthcare. An RN basically would have to lose their license before they were unhirable in most instances by somebody else 2 weeks later, right? And I think the same probably goes in IT and the fact that there's not really like a license there, right? So, and there and production workers, right? Like I can leave my manufacturing facility today, and drive down the road half a mile to the other manufacturing facility and probably walk in and get a job. And we're not looking at those situations as if we're the candidate often enough and understanding how like, we wouldn't maybe look at a new opportunity after 2 weeks if the onboarding experience was bad, but the majority of your employees might, right? So
Right.
how do we make time or what would be the recommendation as a kind of a starting point to how to evaluate the onboarding process if you don't have any tools or technology in place, Jesse?
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do that I recommend for everybody is two things. One, basically go undercover in your own interviewing process and put yourself as like a fake candidate. Don't do this like all the time, but once a year, have an executive go through the interview process and then figure out what's working, what's not. That's one way. And then same thing for the onboarding process is have one of your executives sit through it, whether it's an HR leader or recruiting leader or whomever is in charge of that process and figure out what's working, what's not. I think that's the biggest thing. And in addition to that, I actually think you should go and if you're in recruiting specifically, you should go and interview with other companies once a year just to see what that looks like, what works, what doesn't. And I've actually had some of my favorite like takeaways from recruiting, like, wow, that company had an amazing, follow-up. For example, like I interviewed with, and I wasn't interested in the role per se, but I interviewed with Netflix a couple of years ago. And what's really cool about Netflix is no matter what, at least at the time, is they will call every single candidate they phone screen back. They will not send you an email rejection. They'll actually reject you on the phone, which is kind of cool. Very high touch, very like thoughtful process as opposed to just getting like that generic email at like 5 p.m. on Friday. So stuff like that you can learn that are just like fine tuning your process and making it world class by taking takeaways from other world class recruiting organizations.
There's two things that you haven't said the word over kind of the last 5 or 10 minutes, but feedback is like the central theme of what we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes. Yep. And it's feedback from a number of different places, but just the idea of doing exit interviews and doing post-interview interviews, right? And understanding how people felt, like how did we make you feel through this process? Did you feel welcomed? Was the process easy? I think there was a TikTok, and I'm not on TikTok, but I think it was shared on LinkedIn this week. I want to state first and foremost that I am not on TikTok, but it was shared on LinkedIn, and it was a young woman who was pretending on one end to be the applicant tracking system and on the other end pretending to be the candidate, and just the whole experience of submitting an application with your resume and then having to enter all of your job history manually, which is the absolute worst process. And it has to be an absolute stopper for so many good candidates because nobody that has a job is going to waste time filling out all that information, right? But just, getting that feedback and understanding what people like about not just your company, but the process, because that's where you can make small changes that are very easy to institute, right? And we don't look at that often enough. The process is what separates you from the competition. And like your point with Netflix, I mean, that's a bit of a significant undertaking. I got to thank for Netflix and the amount of applicants and things that they talk to.
Right.
But you remember it.
Yep. Yeah, it stands out in my memory as one of the.
Whereas if it's a bad experience, you'd be like, you know what? Screw Netflix. I'm buying Hulu and canceling my Netflix subscription.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's even more important if you're a consumer-facing company, right? If you're B2B, it probably doesn't matter as much.
Right.
But if you're consumer-facing, right, where I'm a Netflix actual subscriber, it's probably really important to to keep those people happy no matter what. So yeah.
Absolutely, no doubt. So if uh, we're kind of getting close on time, but there's one last topic that I want to hit on, which kind of ties back to why we're here today and what your experience has been. But um, you talked about being a bootstrapped organization yourself. You've talked about working with startups. I'd like for you to compare and contrast how you would build a recruitment function in a high growth organization, mind you. Like, we're growing, but one has private equity money, investment dollars, whereas the other is bootstrapped. How do you compare and contrast what building those teams out would look like in your thoughts?
Yeah, it's very much different, right? So like we actually work with a few of my colleagues and friends companies that are bootstrapped, right? They're software companies and they're profitable and they're doing really well. And so shameless plug, I recommend in this case just using a scalable, repeatable solution for your hiring needs if you're profitable, right? Where it's recruiting like an RPO basically, where you're coming in for 3 to 6 months, helping them hire, going off for 3 to 6 months, coming back. And that's what we've done with a few different organizations. They don't have that permanent need, and it saves them a ton of money, right? They don't need somebody full-time taking equity and all of that on an annual basis, because there's nothing for them to do, but they do need help every, once a quarter, a year, right? 3 months a year, 4 months a year. So that's my best advice. It's a lot cheaper than using like traditional contingency and a lot less work. That's probably my best advice. And if you can't find a good RPO, which I'd be surprised if you can't, you could always hire like a contract recruiter. I think RPO is a little bit better in the sense that you're getting guarantees behind, like we generally guarantee our work, right? Like we're going to help you hire 5 engineers. If we commit to it, we're going to hire 5 engineers, right? Consultants usually won't work for free. We will if we don't deliver. So that's kind of nice. I think on the flip side, it's scalable. Like if you're a hyper growth company taking private equity or venture capital money, I think the big thing there would be, again, have your own internal TA team and figure out what you need to do to ramp up. I think the tough part for a lot of orgs is they'll overhire on the recruiting side, and then they'll have to fire a bunch of recruiters. That happened at Airbnb this last year and a few other places, and then they try to hire people back, and that's not a good. It's obviously going to hurt a lot of people's feelings towards your company, which obviously nobody wants. So I think using a mixed solution where you have your internal TA team and then using RPO as a bridge to, like, you don't even have to make a long-term commitment with a lot of RPO companies. Do 6 months, do 12, and then scale up or down based off your needs. I think you can find solutions there that'll help you scale quickly. I know that's what a lot of hyper-growth companies done, Airbnb included, Coinbase, and others. So.
It's nice talking to another RPO guy in that instance, because I think that we both see that value, right? And the fact that you don't have to do it all yourself. And to be honest, it's not even that economical to try to do it all yourself. It doesn't matter what size your organization is. Really, if you have a need, why go out and hire additional full-time resources when you could partner with someone and create a long-term partnership that's scalable, right? I mean, we have clients the same way, that when they need us, we're there for them, and we already know their process. We know who they are. We know everything about them. But yet when we're done, they turn off the lights and we walk out and the floor is clean and we're good to go.
And I think RPO is such like it's an old old term, right? I think really what it comes down to, the modern workforce is recruiting as a service, right? Like we offer recruiting as a service, and like you said, there's no information loss because we keep everything documented and how those processes run and operate. And so it's much more streamlined and efficient than hiring somebody externally and having to ramp them up.
Are we going to start using the term RAS? Is that
RAS? That's it.
Are we okay? Yeah. We're RAS firms. I like it. That should help us hire much better now that we're RAS firms. Jesse, this has been great. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I'm glad we were able to have this conversation, and I hope that we can have you on again in the future. Maybe we can rehash some of these conversations once we're in a post lockdown-ish world and see what talent looks like a year, 18 months, 24 months from now. What do you think?
Yeah, it'd be a lot of fun. Hopefully we can do it live.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you share with our listeners how to find you and maybe what to expect when they follow you on Twitter and LinkedIn?
Yeah. First off, thanks for having me on, Chris. It's been a lot of fun. And You can follow me on Twitter at Jesse Tinsley. Same thing at LinkedIn. It's just linkedin.com/Jesse Tinsley. And I post and tweet about all sorts of things, recruiting and HR related and workplace. And yeah, would love to have you guys follow along there. And if you guys ever have any questions, feel free to DM me. Happy to talk. So.
Absolutely. There's some great conversations that take place in Jesse's Twitter feed, and it's a great way to learn and engage with people from around the country and the world, really. So make sure you check him out there. And that's a wrap, everyone, of this episode of the Talent Tide podcast. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and rate wherever you listen or watch the podcast, from Apple to Spotify to YouTube. Go win the day, and remember that success is on the other side of fear. Thank you.